John Hutchinson. A man born into a world where ignorance was the norm and despair the common lot. He wore no academic gown. He belonged to no scholarly circles, but he witnessed suffering and he sought a way out. He dared to challenge centuries-old dogmas. He traveled to unexplored lands. He subjected himself to what others considered madness. He didn't just invent, he discovered. He uncovered a path to healing. He became the king of a new era of medicine. His name resonated. His methods saved lives. But this triumph was fragile. He faced the wrath of those who defended the old world, those who feared his discoveries. His story is no tale of sudden enlightenment. It is a battle for the future. Forget the myths of Eureka. True discoveries don't come in a sudden flash. They are born from sweat, blood, and immense perseverance, from a solitary struggle against the current, from a desperate search for light in the darkness. This is how progress was born. This is how John Hutchinson worked. For centuries, humanity lived under the shadow of ignorance. Illness was perceived as punishment, as a mystical blight, as a disruption of an invisible balance. There was no understanding of its nature. There were no ways to stop it, only desperate attempts to alleviate suffering, which more often than not only exacerbated it. Physicians, if they could even be called that, relied on the works of the ancients. Galen and Hippocrates, whose theories remained unshaken for almost 1,500 years, dictated every step. Blood was let to expel bad humors. Incisions were cauterized with boiling oil, believing it cleansed the wound. Pus was considered laudable, a sign of recovery, not infection. Death was a constant companion. Epidemics decimated cities. Any wound, any ailment, could be a death sentence. Surgery without anesthesia was torture. Amputations were performed blindly, accompanied by screams and horror. Survivors often remained crippled, their lives a continuous pain. This was a world where the fear of disease was stronger than the belief in healing, a world where life ended abruptly and comfort was found only in prayers and superstitions. John Hutchinson was born in 1795, not within the walls of academies, nor among scholarly treatises. He was born in Yorkshire, into a family with no money, no titles, and no connections to open doors to the world of respectable medicine. Life itself became his university, suffering his classroom. From a young age he saw what most tried to ignore: festering wounds, convulsive fevers, faces contorted with pain. He was part of this world where medicine remained the domain of charlatans and ignorant healers. But unlike others, Hutchinson did not accept this reality. He did not resign himself to the inevitable. He sought answers. His path led him to hospitals, places where human bodies became living laboratories for ancient, often deadly, dogmas. He was not a doctor. He was an apprentice, an assistant, a witness. He observed the work of those who called themselves healers. He saw blood gushing from veins, wounds cauterized with red-hot iron, bodies dissected without the slightest understanding of anatomy. His eyes saw not laudable pus, but deadly infection. His ears heard not the moans of healing, but the death rattle. He saw patients dying not from disease, but from treatment. How, after bloodletting, a weakened body finally gave up. How, after cauterization, wounds blackened and festered. He saw children suffocating from diphtheria, while doctors believed in bad vapors. How mothers died from puerperal fever, their deaths attributed to female weakness. With each day spent within those walls, his conviction grew. This path led not to healing, but to the grave. He saw helplessness. He saw arrogance. He saw how the authority of Galen and Hippocrates mattered more than a human life. This horrifying, everyday reality became his greatest teacher. It sowed doubt within him. a deep, burning, relentless doubt that forced him to reject everything he had been taught. It pushed him onto his own uncharted path, a path where every step was a challenge and every idea heresy. He had to find another way. He had to find salvation. Into this world, permeated by fear and despair, came John Hutchinson. He was not the heir to a noble lineage. He did not hold a degree from a prestigious university. His hands were those of a laborer, and his mind that of an inquisitive researcher. Born into a family where every day was a struggle for survival, he learned the harshness of life from a young age. But within him burned a fire of curiosity, a thirst to understand how the world worked, and most importantly, how to improve it. John Hutchinson did not study in medical schools where ancient dogmas reigned. He learned where pain was palpable and death inevitable within the walls of an ordinary hospital. He began working there as a boy, watching as doctors, cloaked in their robes of authority, performed rituals that only exacerbated suffering. He saw how bloodletting weakened people rather than healing them. How wounds cauterized with red-hot iron festered even more. He heard the screams of those undergoing amputations without anesthesia and saw their faces distorted by terror. Every day he witnessed the helplessness hidden behind a facade of scholarship. He saw patients dying from simple wounds, from fevers, from diseases that seemed to defy any explanation. Doctors would nod, citing bad humors or corruption. But Hutchinson didn't believe it. He saw not mysticism, but chaos, not healing, but methodical destruction. His sharp mind refused to accept explanations that had nothing but centuries of delusion behind them. He asked questions no one dared to voice. Why did some methods work and others not? Why did pus, which they called laudable, always lead to death? Why did the pain not subside, but only intensify? These questions burned within him, transforming from simple curiosity into a deep, almost physical revulsion towards the existing system. He could not accept that a human life was worth so little, and its suffering so much. And it was this rejection, this inner disagreement, that became his starting point. He didn't just doubt, he acted. Every day within the hospital walls was not routine for him, but a field for observation. He saw thousands of wounds blacken from cauterization, how bodies writhed in pain that brought no healing, and one day, in a stuffy, blood-soaked room, fate itself gave him a chance. A young soldier with a pierced leg lay on the operating table. The wound was deep, ragged. Protocol required cauterizing it with boiling oil to cleanse it and stop the bleeding. The surgeon was already reaching for the red-hot ladle, but his gaze fell upon an empty vessel. The oil was gone. A tense silence hung in the air. The surgeon cursed angrily. What to do? Postpone the operation? The soldier was bleeding out. It was then that John Hutchinson made his move. He didn't ask for permission. He simply acted. He grabbed a clean, freshly boiled cloth. Nearby stood a basin of clean water intended for washing hands. He soaked the cloth and gently, yet persistently, began to wash the soldier's wound. Again and again, blood mixed with water, but the pus, the expected laudable pus, did not appear. The surgeon looked at him as if he were mad. "What are you doing, boy? You'll kill him," he hissed. But Hutchinson did not back down. He washed until the water was almost clear. Then he took another clean cloth, dried the wound, and applied a simple, dry dressing. Hours passed. The soldier did not die. The next day, when the dressing was removed, the wound looked different. There was no blackness from a burn. There was no characteristic stench. The red, inflamed edges were not swollen. There was no pus. Instead, the wound was clean with pink beginning to scar edges. The soldier's pain was noticeably less. He was breathing more evenly. It was impossible. It contradicted every rule, every dogma known for 1,000 years. The wound had not been cauterized. It had not been cleansed by fire. Yet it was healing. Cleanliness, simplicity. These words seemed to be whispered by the wound itself. Hutchinson not only saved the soldier's life, he saved him from torture. He showed that there was another way, a way where one did not need to inflict pain to heal. This was the first, quiet but deafening blow to the foundation of old medicine. A blow born not from theory, but from desperate necessity and an unwavering belief in observation. He continued his experiments, in secret, using clean water, changing dressings, monitoring every detail. He began to notice that the wounds he kept clean healed faster, with fewer complications. That simple care, not aggressive intervention, was the key. He began to collect his own data, his own evidence. Every successful healing was a silent judgment against centuries of delusion. He understood his discoveries were not just new methods, they were a different philosophy. A philosophy that began with the understanding that the body is capable of healing itself if it is not hindered, and that the main task of a doctor is to help it in this, not to harm it in the name of dogmas. It was a revolution that began with clean water and one bold hand. He didn't just observe, he saw. He saw what others ignored. The first successful wound was not an end, but a beginning. The beginning of an endless series of questions. Why did it work? What exactly? The water, the cloth, or the absence of fire? Hutchinson did not rush to conclusions. His mind worked like a machine, collecting data, analyzing, seeking patterns. He did not trust authorities. He trusted his eyes and his hands. Every patient, every wound, became a textbook for him. He continued his secret experiments, washed wounds with clean water, changed dressings with frightening frequency. He noticed that not all water was suitable. Water from a dirty bucket, even boiled, yielded worse results than fresh running water. He didn't know about microbes, but he saw their consequences. He learned from every failure. If a wound festered, he didn't attribute it to bad humors. He asked, what did I do wrong? Maybe the dressing wasn't clean enough? Maybe I didn't wash it thoroughly enough? Or too late? This was not just treatment. It was research. Hutchinson methodically recorded his observations. He compared wounds cauterized by the old method with those he treated himself. The difference was astonishing. Where before there was blackness and pus, now appeared pink, healthy tissue. Where there were screams of pain, now there was relieved breathing. He collected evidence, one piece after another. Every healing was a brick in the foundation of new medicine. His genius lay in his empiricism. He did not build theories based on ancient texts. He built them based on experience. He acted on the principle, do it, see what happens, and do better. If something didn't work, he didn't invent mystical explanations. He changed his approach. He looked for the cause. This was a revolution in thinking itself, from dogma to experiment, from faith to knowledge. But knowledge confined within hospital walls would not change the world. Hutchinson understood his discoveries had to become accessible to all, not just to scholars speaking Latin. He began to write. He wrote in simple, understandable language accessible to anyone who could read. He published small notes, pamphlets, articles. He described his methods, his observations. In detail, without embellishment. He was not afraid to call things by their names. Old methods were murder. He also understood that new tools were needed to implement new methods, or at least clean tools. He didn't invent complex apparatuses. He invented simplicity. He insisted on boiling instruments before use, on using only clean bandages. He developed special, easily sterilizable dressings that allowed wounds to breathe while protecting against contamination. His inventions were not mechanisms, but protocols, a system of actions based on cleanliness and observation. Gradually, his works began to spread, first whispered, then openly. Doctors, tired of helplessness and constant deaths, began to listen. Not all, but those who dared to try saw the result. He didn't convince them with words. He convinced them with facts, with healed wounds, with saved lives. This was the most powerful form of persuasion. Hutchinson did not seek fame. He sought healing. He was not afraid to admit his mistakes if they led to new discoveries. He was not afraid to go against the current. His path was not the path of a genius illuminated by a sudden flash. It was the path of a persistent, methodical worker who, step by step, paved the way to the future. He learned from every mistake, turning failure into experience. He shared every success, turning knowledge into a tool. He didn't just change treatment methods, he changed the approach to medicine. He showed that truth was not in ancient books, but in living, breathing reality. In observation, in cleanliness, in the courage to reject the old for the new. But courage, based on facts, always challenges established norms. And this challenge did not go unanswered. The medical establishment, which for centuries had relied on the authority of the ancients and the immutability of dogmas, saw John Hutchinson not as an innovator, but as a dangerous heretic. His methods, so simple and effective, were a direct insult to their scholarship, their years of practice, their worldview. The first reaction was contempt. Who was this self-taught man from Yorkshire, some boy apprentice who dared to dispute the wisdom of Galen and Hippocrates? Professors in their gowns, sitting in their offices, scoffed. They called him a dilettante, an ignoramus, a charlatan. His actions, they claimed, were not science, but dangerous sorcery. He wasn't healing, but merely delaying the inevitable, hiding laudable pus behind clean dressings. Accusations poured in. He was called a charlatan, a fraud, a murderer who deprived patients of their only chance at healing, bloodletting, and cauterization. He violates the sacred laws of medicine, some cried. His methods lack scientific basis, others echoed, forgetting that their own scientific bases were merely rewritten treatises from 1,500 years ago. He was threatened with lawsuits, disbarment from practice, denial of access to hospitals. His name was slandered in newspapers, his works called dangerous nonsense, capable of destroying the foundations of healing. But Hutchinson did not give up. He had no army of followers, but he had undeniable evidence, healed wounds, surviving patients. And it was this evidence, these saved lives, that began to draw the attention of those who were willing to see. Not all doctors were blind. Some, tired of powerlessness and daily deaths, began to listen. Among them were those in high positions. They might not have understood why it worked, but they saw that it worked. The first patrons appeared. These were people whose relatives or subordinates had been saved by Hutchinson's methods. Military officers who saw their soldiers return to duty after wounds previously considered fatal. Noble ladies whose children escaped the fate of thousands of others who died from simple infections. They provided him with protection, resources, and, most importantly, access to new patients. They became his shield against the wrath of the conservative world. They not only funded his research, but also built his reputation, not as a scholar, but as a practitioner whose results spoke for themselves. The conflict intensified. On one side, centuries of tradition, powerful and unyielding, armed with authority and fear. On the other, a lone man, armed only with clean water, common sense, and astonishing results. This was not just a scientific discussion, it was a battle for minds, a battle for lives. and every patient John Hutchinson saved was not just a victory over disease, but a direct challenge to those who refused to see the obvious. The medical establishment, unable to withstand Hutchinson's growing influence and his heretical methods, went all in. They initiated a public hearing, a medical tribunal, whose aim was not discussion, but a demonstrative condemnation. The venue was a large hall, packed to capacity with professors in their gowns, influential doctors, and a public eager for a spectacle. John Hutchinson, a man without a diploma, without a title, stood before this assembly alone, against the full might of centuries of tradition. The accusations were familiar: charlatanism, recklessness, disregard for the sacred works of the ancients. One after another, respected professors branded his clean water as a dangerous novelty, and his simple dressings as an attempt to conceal inevitable failures. They cited patients who, according to their dogmas, should have died under his treatment. But Hutchinson was prepared. He did not engage in abstract arguments. He did not try to prove his point with words. He brought his witnesses, not charts and treatises, but living, breathing proof. One by one, his former patients came forward, those whom traditional medicine had condemned to death or lifelong disability. A soldier with a fully healed leg, walking without a limp. A child whose feverish delirium had given way to healthy sleep, without the slightest trace of the festering infection that doctors called laudable pus. A mother saved from puerperal fever, holding her healthy infant in her arms. Each testimony was a blow, not to a person, but to the very foundation of the old system. The public saw not theoretical calculations, but tangible, undeniable results. Healed flesh, clear eyes, confident voices, they spoke louder than any scientific treatises. The culmination came when a patient with a severe, festering wound, one that usually led to inevitable amputation or death, was brought onto the podium. The tribunal demanded that Hutchinson demonstrate his dangerous method right there, before everyone. Under hundreds of scrutinizing gazes, he calmly and methodically set to work. Not fire, not red-hot iron, but boiled water and clean cloths. He explained each step, his voice steady, his hands confident. The old guard raged. Some tried to interrupt him, to discredit him, but the sheer simplicity and obvious effectiveness of his actions, combined with the patient's clear relief, gradually silenced them. A few days later, when the patient's wound showed clear signs of healing, clean, without pus, without stench, the truth became undeniable. The tribunal was forced to concede. It was not a defeat in their eyes, but it was a forced acknowledgment of the effectiveness of his methods. It was not just Hutchinson's victory, it was the triumph of observation over dogma, of pragmatism over tradition. From that day, the whispers of contempt gave way to a roar of approval. The man once called a charlatan was now proclaimed a visionary. Hospitals that had once closed their doors to him now sought his advice. Doctors who had been his fiercest critics cautiously began to adopt his methods. He was not merely tolerated, he was revered. His simple, radical ideas, once considered heresy, became the new standard. He was not just a practitioner, he became a teacher, a reformer, a guiding star. John Hutchinson, the self-taught man, not only saved countless lives. With clean water and unwavering courage, he led medicine out of darkness. He became its king. The tribunal's recognition opened the floodgates. Hutchinson's methods were no longer secret experiments. They became official protocols. Surgery was the first to change. The barbaric practice of cauterizing wounds with red-hot iron and boiling oil became a thing of the past. In its place came cleanliness and delicacy. Doctors began to use boiled water, not just water, but clean, boiled water. Wounds were thoroughly washed, not burned. From then on, pus was no longer considered laudable. It became a sign of infection. Its appearance required immediate and repeated washing. Dressings were changed not once every few days, but several times a day. They had to be sterile, made from fresh boiled material. Instruments, scalpels, probes, forceps, were now also boiled before every operation. This seemed excessive, but the results spoke for themselves. Survival statistics changed dramatically. If previously, at best, 2 out of 10 patients survived after limb amputation, that number now rose to 6, or even 7. Mortality from puerperal fever, which decimated women in hospitals, decreased several-fold. Simple fractures, which often led to purulent infections and amputations, now healed without complications. Blood poisoning, the scourge of the 18th century, became much rarer. These changes were not instantaneous. Resistance remained, but the facts were stubborn. Hospitals that implemented the new rules of cleanliness saw a sharp drop in mortality. This was undeniable. Soon, throughout England and then in Europe, outdated medical practices began to be revised. In medical schools, where Galen had once been rote-learned, practical lessons on wound care were now introduced. Students were taught not to bleed, but to wash, not to cauterize, but to bandage. Surgical wards, once breeding grounds for infections, began to transform. Requirements for ventilation, clean floors, and waste disposal emerged. Hutchinson not only changed treatment methods, he changed the very culture of healing. He showed that it wasn't mystical humors or vapors that killed. It was dirt, ignorance, and neglect of basic hygiene that killed. His ideas spread beyond hospitals. In the Army, where injuries were commonplace, the implementation of his protocols saved thousands of soldiers' lives. In the Navy, where the slightest scratch could lead to gangrene, cleanliness became law. This was not just a medical discovery, it was a paradigm shift that affected all areas of life where there was a risk of injury and infection. It was the first step towards modern asepsis. The world where death from a simple wound was the norm began to recede before a new reality, a reality built on cleanliness and knowledge. Thus concluded one of the most unusual triumphs in medical history. John Hutchinson was not a scientist. He was not an heir. He was a man of the people whose only laboratory was the hospital and his instrument, his own eyes. He did not invent a complex machine. He invented cleanliness. He discovered that salvation was not in ancient texts, but in simple, boiled water, not in bloodletting, but in care, not in arrogance, but in observation. His path was that of an adventurer who challenged a world where fear and ignorance were law. He risked everything to prove the obvious, and by doing so, he became the king of a new era, an era where life was valued above dogma, and healing became possible. His legacy? Not in bronze statues, but in every clean wound, in every survivor. In the understanding that true progress is born not from high-flown theories, but from the courage to see what is right before one's eyes and to act accordingly.